Hello everyone. Tonight, we are diving into a tale that has lived in the shadows of myth, wrapped in poetry, and painted in bronze and fires. We're talking about the legendary War of Troy. It's a story filled with gods, egos, and a giant wooden horse that changed history, or maybe just made a great bedtime story. Either way, you will not survive, unless you stay comfy, keep breathing, and maybe laugh once or twice. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And hey, tell me where and what time you're listening to this. Are you in INT at 11 p.m., London at 4 p.m., Mars at midnight? I want to know. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. Before there was war, there was wind, but not just any wind. It was the kind of wind that made sailors feel like someone up there was having fun at their expense. The Greeks stood on the shores of Aulis, ships lined up like dominoes made of pine, waiting for the gods to stop playing games and let them sail to Troy. But let's rewind a little. Why was everyone so eager to attack this one city? The official story starts with a wedding. You know, the kind where gods are invited, everyone's dressed in gold, and someone absolutely has to ruin it. In this case, it was Eris, goddess of discord, because when you don't get invited to a party, what else do you do but show up with a golden apple, labeled to the fairest? That apple led to three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, arguing like ancient influencers over who deserved the title. Poor Paris, the handsome prince of Troy, got the honor read, curse of being the judge. Aphrodite promised him the most beautiful woman in the world, and Paris, like every guy who's ever thought with his heart or less noble parts, chose her. That woman, unfortunately, was already married, Helen of Sparta, married to King Menelaus, who, spoiler alert, wasn't thrilled when Paris sailed back to Troy with her. So, yes, the war began because of love, or pride, or maybe a divine prank. Historians still debate whether Helen even existed or whether she was just a poetic metaphor for, well, a lot of things. Back to the beach. The Greek fleet was ready, soldiers were restless, and the gods, still not helping. The winds refused to blow. That's when Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks and brother of the very angry Menelaus, decided that maybe, just maybe, a little sacrifice might do the trick. That's how Iphigenia, his own daughter, ended up being offered to the gods. Ancient times, ancient choices, a detail often left out. Some say Artemis took pity and replaced her with a deer at the last second. Others say Iphigenia didn't get so lucky. Either way, the wind came, and the ships sailed. Now, you might imagine, an epic battle at sea, sails fluttering, arrows flying. Nope, the Greeks landed at the shores of Troy and surprise, met resistance. Turns out, the Trojans weren't exactly eager to hand over Helen with a bouquet and a thank you note, and so began the infamous siege. Not days, not months, but 10 whole years. And here's a fun fact. During that first landing, a certain warrior, named Protislaus, was the first to jump off the boat and set foot on Trojan soil. A brave act, except there was a prophecy that whoever stepped first would die. And well, guess who forgot to read the fine print? So yes, the war began with questionable decisions, emotional men, and meddling gods. Exactly the kind of ancient drama we're here for. Meanwhile, inside the city, things weren't as simple as Trojans bad, Greeks good. Troy was a thriving city, full of clever engineers, elegant nobles, and warriors who believed just as fiercely in their cause. Some even argued that Troy was more advanced than many Greek city-states at the time. Its walls were so high and thick that even the bravest Greek generals just stood there looking up, wondering how exactly one storms a city built like a divine fortress. Oh, and there's this odd little archaeological tidbit in the ruins of what some believe was Troy. Researchers found layers of burnt rubble and arrowheads. They also found, drumroll please, several children's toys buried in the ash. Yes, somewhere between all the spears and fire, there were kids playing just days before it all went up in smoke. But we're not there yet. For now, the stage is set, ships have landed, heroes have drawn their swords, and the gods are watching like it's the premiere of the year. Paris has Helen, the Greeks have rage, and somewhere out there, someone is sketching plans for a very big horse. And if you're wondering whether this was all just a big soap opera in bronze armor, well, yes, but it's the best kind. We'll dive deeper into Helen's story next time. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, the sails are billowing, drums are beating, and war has begun not with a bang, but with a whisper from the wind. When Helen first set foot inside the towering gates of Troy, the air was thick with a mix of awe, suspicion, and whispers. She was beautiful, so beautiful that even the guards holding spears paused longer than they should have. But beauty, as history has shown us, rarely comes without baggage. Troy wasn't just any city. It was wealthy, strategically perched near the Dardanelles, and blessed with walls so massive even giants would have considered second thoughts. And now, with Helen arriving under Paris's arm like a prize from Olympus, things got awkward fast. You could practically hear the tension echoing off the marble floors. King Priam, Paris's father, welcomed her with diplomatic smiles, but likely had a scroll's worth of internal screaming. The Trojans knew this wasn't going to end in happy songs and olive branches. Their prince had just snatched the Queen of Sparta. That's not the kind of move that gets overlooked on the international gossip scrolls. Inside the royal palace, Helen was given silk, perfumes, and servants. But she wasn't exactly embraced by all. Some saw her as a guest, others a curse in human form. Andromache, wife of Hector Paris's older, vastly more responsible brother, kept her distance respectfully, but unmistakably. She had a child to raise and a husband to worry about. Not time for god-cursed love triangles. Helen, for her part, didn't melt into Paris's arms with giggles and poetry. Some say she regretted everything. Others say she had no choice, that the gods manipulated her will. And of course, there's the classic historian's fallback. We may never truly know, because let's be honest, ancient records aren't exactly great at recording women's inner thoughts. Meanwhile, back in Greece, Menelaus was having the worst husband experience in ancient history. Helen was gone, his pride was wounded, and, thanks to Agamemnon's influence, every Greek king with a sword, an unresolved trauma, was now on his side. Enter Odysseus of Ithaca. He didn't want to go to war. He had a newborn at home, and preferred clever words to swinging spears. In fact, he pretended to be insane plowing his field with salt, wearing mismatched clothes. But Greek recruiters were persistent. They threw his baby in front of the plow, forcing him to reveal the act. Talk about aggressive military drafting. And then there was Achilles, tall, shiny, and practically radiating main character energy. He was the son of Thetis, a sea nymph, and Peleus, a mortal king. Thetis, like any overprotective parent, wanted him to be immortal. So, she dipped him in the river Styx for that one unfortunate spot on his heel. Yep, that heel. Achilles didn't want to go to war either. His mother knew it would mean his death. So she hid him on an island disguised as a girl among royal daughters. Imagine that. The future greatest warrior, in a wig and dress, playing the lute, probably rolling his eyes behind a fan. But again, recruiters ruin everything. Odysseus figured it out. He laid out weapons among the girl's trinkets and waited. When Achilles instinctively grabbed a sword, the jig was up. Off to Troy he went. Now, the Greeks had their avengers assembled. Agamemnon, Menelaus, Odysseus, Achilles, Ajax, Diomedes, name it. But a lesser-known member of the crew, a seer named Calchas, who was basically their fortune-teller in a cloak. And here's where it gets weird. During one stopover, en route to Troy, Calchas pointed at a wriggling snake that slithered up a tree and ate 9 birds before turning to stone. Normal Tuesday, right? Calchas declared that this was a sign from Zeus. The war would last 10 years, and only in the 10th year would victory come. Talk about dramatic foreshadowing. When the Greeks finally landed, the Trojans weren't standing around with a welcome banner. They had Hector, prince and commander, who made Paris look like a kid playing dress-up. Hector was everything a warrior. King should be disciplined, brave, and perpetually exasperated with his younger brother's romantic adventure. The early years of the siege were full of raids, skirmishes, and awkward negotiations. The Greeks built a beach camp, essentially turning the coast into a city of tents and campfires. They fought by day and sulked by night. Supply lines were stretched, morale rose and fell like tides, and more than a few arguments broke out over stolen cattle and bruised egos. Some odd details get glossed over, like the time a Trojan named Pandarus broke a truce by shooting Menelaus with an arrow because the gods decided peace was boring, or the fact that Achilles had his own personal bard follow him around camp like a hype man, singing of his exploits before breakfast. And let's not forget Patroclus, Achilles' best friend, confidant, and arguably the only person who could talk him down when his temper flared. Their bond, deep. How deep? We'll get to that. By the end of the second year, both sides were tired. The Greeks still hadn't breached the walls. The Trojans, while confident, were also worried. The war had turned from a rescue mission into a long, grueling campaign that drained coffers and spilled royal blood. But the gods were just getting warmed up. Up on Mount Olympus, they were choosing sides like kids at recess. Hera and Athena backed the Greeks, still bitter about losing that beauty contest. Aphrodite, Team Troy, obviously. Apollo and Artemis. With Troy, Poseidon flip-flopped depending on his mood and the tides. Their interventions weren't subtle. 1 minute a storm would appear out of nowhere. The next, a spear would fly straighter than physics should allow. And sometimes, entire battles hinged on a god's boredom. So now, the stage was set for betrayal, glory, and that infamous rage of Achilles. But that's another part of the story. For now, we leave Helen staring from her tower, warriors sharpening blades in the flicker of campfires, and gods peeking through the clouds like nosy neighbors. And maybe, just maybe, someone in Troy had the bright idea, what if we just gave her back? But by then, it was already too late. By year 3 of the Trojan War, nobody was having a good time. The Greek army, still camped stubbornly on the shores of Anatolia, had settled into a strange rhythm of battle and boredom. Imagine tens of thousands of men, all hyped up to fight, for honor, stuck in a coastal camping trip that had long overstayed its welcome. Tents sagged, tempers flared, and the only thing worse than a Trojan arrow was the smell of unwashed heroes arguing over whose goat stew tasted more like dirt. Achilles, as usual, was brooding. His tent was bigger than most, almost like a mini, and he refused to eat dinner without a proper performance from his lyre player. Because, of course, a near-invincible warrior needs a soundtrack for his sulking. Patroclus was the only one who could lift his mood, but even he struggled during these years. Achilles wanted glory, not this endless grind. Meanwhile, the Trojans had become adept at defense. They would peek out of the gates, launch surprise attacks, then retreat behind their seemingly impenetrable walls. Hector led these charges, always calm, always precise, like the world's most responsible big brother. Honestly, if Hector ran the war, it might have ended in a week with a handshake and a polite return policy. But then came the plague. It started with animals, horses foaming at the mouth, goats keeling over mid. Soon, Greek soldiers were collapsing, their skin hot, their breaths shallow. Flies buzzed in thick clouds, and the stench around the camp became unbearable. Some claimed Apollo himself had loosed arrows of disease into the camp. Why? Well, Agamemnon had insulted one of Apollo's priests by refusing to return his daughter. Divine punishment via pestilence. Classic Olympus move. Achilles, fed up, stormed into Agamemnon's tent. Words were shouted, egos bruised, and in the end, Agamemnon pulled the ultimate power move. He seized Achilles' war prize, a woman named Bride. That went about as well as lighting a torch in a haystack. Achilles exploded, not literally, but close. He declared he would no longer fight for the Greeks. Instead, he would sit in his tent and sulk so hard it echoed across the sea. His Myrmidon's elite warriors, loyal only to him, would sit out too. The Greeks were now missing their best fighter because Agamemnon couldn't swallow his pride. The result? Disaster. The Trojans, sensing weakness, attacked with renewed force. Hector led the charge, breaking through Greek lines, burning ships, and driving the army back toward the shore. At one point, it looked like the Trojans might actually win. A few more days of Achilles sitting in timeout, and the Greeks would have been fish food. In the chaos, we get one of those weird historical footnotes. The seer Calchas had another vision, this time involving a boar's liver, a cracked turtle shell, and some aggressively interpretive dancing. The outcome still, 10 years of war. Thanks Calchas back to Achilles. As much as he enjoyed his petty revenge, he wasn't heartless. When Patroclus came to him, begging to let the Myrmidons return to battle, Achilles made a compromise. He agreed to let Patroclus borrow his armor and lead the charge on one condition. Do not chase them to the gates of Troy. Now, let's all take a moment and guess what happened next. That's right, Patroclus not only chased them to the gates, but ended up facing Hector himself in single combat. The duel was swift, tragic, and inevitable. Hector, though honorable, did what he had to do. Patroclus fell, the armor stripped, and news of his death reached Achilles like a thunderclap. What followed is often called the true turning point of the war. Achilles didn't just mourn, he unraveled. He covered himself in ash, screamed at the heavens, and vowed to kill Hector in a way that would make poets weep for centuries. He reconciled with Agamemnon, rejoined the fight, and then, well, things got bloody fast. PG-13 bloody, we promise. But here's the oddity of it all. Before Achilles re-entered the battlefield, his mother Thetis brought him new armor forged by Hephaestus, the god of fire. This armor, not just shiny, it was legendary. The shield alone was a full-on mural of the world, with rivers, cities, dancing children, and constellations. Basically, an ancient version of a cinematic universe in bronze. Achilles blazed through the battlefield like a comet. Trojans fled at the mere sight of him. He didn't stop for speeches or posturing. He cut through the ranks until he found Hector. Now, this duel wasn't a surprise. Hector knew it was coming. He stood before the gates of Troy while his family begged him to come inside. But Hector was a man of honor. He faced Achilles alone. Their battle was fierce and fast. Hector, brave to the end, tried to land a killing blow, but Achilles, with his divine armor and righteous fury, was too much. The spear struck true, and Hector fell, and then Achilles snapped. Instead of honoring the body, he tied Hector's corpse to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy, over and over. The Trojans watched in horror. Hector's parents wept. Even the gods turned away. It was the moment when Achilles, once a symbol of heroic greatness, tipped into something darker, yet something remarkable followed. King Priam, Hector's father, did what no one expected. He snuck into the Greek camp, knelt before Achilles, and begged for his son's body. He kissed the hands that killed his boy, and for the first time in weeks, Achilles remembered what it meant to be human. He wept. He returned Hector's body, allowed a proper funeral, and for a brief moment, the war paused in shared mourning. That's the funny thing about ancient wars. Even amidst the rage, revenge, and divine chaos, moments of compassion sneak in like lanterns flickering in fog. But don't worry, the Greeks weren't done yet. There was still that giant wooden horse waiting to make its entrance. Peace, like fresh bread in a siege, never lasted long at Troy. After Hector's funeral, the war slogged on with a kind of exhausted inevitability. Both sides had lost their brightest stars. The Greeks were mourning Patroclus. The Trojans had buried Hector, and the gods, well, they were still playing dice with human lives and arguing over who liked whom best. Achilles, though briefly softened by Priam's plea, returned to battle with his rage only partially tempered. He had become a different kind of hero, less poetic, more terrifying. You know the type, the guy at the party who shows up late, drinks too much ambrosia, and flips the board game because he's losing. But even Achilles couldn't escape fate. It was prophesied, because there's always a prophecy, that Achilles would not survive this war. Everyone knew it. He knew it. But he stayed anyway, because nothing screams Greek tragedy like walking into your doom in slow motion. And so, during yet another assault near the gates of Troy, Paris, the same pretty boy who caused all this, finally stepped up. Now, Paris was not known for his combat skills. He was more of a looks great in armor, but please don't hand him a spear kind of guy. But this time, with the help of the god Apollo guiding his arrow, he let one fly, and it struck Achilles in the one spot not covered by Hephaestus's armor, his heel. And just like that, the greatest warrior of the age fell. The Greeks lost their fire. Achilles was their symbol, their wrath, their legend. Now he was a body on the battlefield, and the tide of war shifted again. But before we descend into total despair, here's a fun footnote. Ancient Egyptian records from around the same time mention a group of wild foreign warriors camped near the Aegean coast, loudly arguing about gods and horsemeat. Coincidence? Maybe. Historians still debate whether the Trojan War spilled into nearby regions or if the Greeks were just incredibly bad tourists. Back to Troy. Achilles' funeral was a big deal. Think burning pyre, dirges, sacrifices, the whole divine VIP list. His ashes were mixed with Patroclus's, because even in death, those two were inseparable. The Greeks held funeral games in his honor, chariot races, boxing matches, even a particularly violent discus competition where two guys lost teeth and gained grudges. Then came the question, Who would get Achilles' divine armor? Odysseus and Ajax both claimed it. Odysseus argued he had the brains and eloquence to honor Achilles' legacy. Ajax, the towering warrior, said, I carried his body out of battle. What more do you want? A vote was held. Odysseus won, because apparently persuasive speeches beat biceps. Ajax didn't take it well. He stormed off into the night, sword in hand, trembling with rage and humiliation. And here's where things get ... weird. He planned to kill the Greek leaders in revenge, but Athena clouded his mind. In his madness, Ajax slaughtered a herd of sheep, believing they were his enemies. When he came to, surrounded by bloody wool and confusion, he was overcome with shame. He fell on his sword. It was one of those moments where the war seemed to eat its own champions. With Achilles and Ajax gone, morale dipped even further. The Greeks were desperate. So desperate, in fact, that they did something truly drastic. They went looking for a new hero. That hero was Neoptolemus, Achilles' teenage son. Yes, apparently Achilles had a kid stashed away on a remote island, being raised in secrecy to avoid the war. Because that's what every demigod dad does. Hides their child on an island until it's time for some generational trauma. The Greeks fetched him, armored him up, and threw him into battle. And surprisingly, he was terrifying like a minion. With even fewer emotional guardrails, Neoptolemus killed ruthlessly, quickly earning a reputation that made even the Trojans whisper behind their helmets. Meanwhile, Odysseus kept doing Odysseus things, sneaking into Troy in disguise, stealing sacred relics, convincing allies to betray each other. At one point, he and Diomedes crept into the city at night and stole the Palladium, a statue of Athena that supposedly protected Troy. Without it, the Greeks believed victory was finally within reach. And then came the big idea, the kind of idea you get after 10 years of failure, 24 dead heroes, and far too many days of stale barley cakes. Odysseus proposed building a giant wooden horse. It would be hollow inside. Greek warriors would hide within it. The rest of the army would pretend to retreat, leaving the horse as a gift to the Trojans. Then, when the horse was taken inside the city, the hidden soldiers would sneak out at night, open the gates, and allow the Greek army who had secretly circled back to pour in. Everyone thought it was insane, which, to be fair, it was. But at that point, they had nothing left to lose, so the Greeks built it. It was enormous, towering over the beach, with wheels, intricate carvings, and a suspiciously empty interior. Into the horse climbed Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, and a few dozen hand-picked warriors. The rest of the army burned their tents, boarded their ships, and sailed out of sight. So it seemed. On the beach, only one Greek remained, Sinon, the best liar in the business. He was captured by the Trojans and spun a story so compelling, it deserved its own bardic trilogy. He claimed the Greeks had left, the horse was an offering to Athena, and that harming it would bring divine wrath. The Trojans, exhausted and eager for a win, debated. Some argued it was a trick. Others said it was a trophy. Then, in walked Glaucon, a priest who famously said, "Beware Greeks bearing gifts." A minute later, he and his sons were eaten by sea serpents. That pretty much sealed the deal. With a shrug, a cheer, and a lot of very bad decision-making, the Trojans rolled the horse into the city. And so, under the fading glow of twilight, the gates of Troy closed, with its doom already inside. The night the horse entered Troy, the city buzzed with a kind of celebration that hadn't been felt in years. Trojans poured into the streets, singing, dancing, and drinking enough wine to pickle an army. After 10 long years, the Greeks were gone. The beach was empty, the ships vanished over the horizon, and the cursed war seemed finally over. Even the grumpy uncles who usually muttered about omens were smiling that night. The massive wooden horse was wheeled through the gates and set in the central square. Kids climbed it, elders circled it, nodding, and if anyone heard faint creaks from inside, they chalked it up to good craftsmanship. Cassandra, the Trojan princess and prophet, cursed never to be believed, tried to warn them. Again, she shouted from the palace steps that disaster was coming, that this was no gift, that their doom sat right there in the open square, like a very large, very obvious red flag. But, as always, no one listened. One soldier patted her shoulder and said, "It's okay, Cassandra. You'll feel better after a little honey wine." Somewhere, the gods were rolling their eyes. As darkness fell, torches were lit. The streets glowed gold. Musicians played lyres, flutes, and drums. A boar was roasted whole. And because every great tragedy needs contrast, Troy that night felt like a city reborn. And then the people slept all over the city. The wine hit hard. Warriors dozed in their armor. Children collapsed on rugs beside hearth fires. Even the guards on the walls leaned lazily against their spears, lulled by the warm breeze and the peace they thought they had earned. Inside the horse, though no one was sleeping, Odysseus waited, counting the minutes. Neoptolemus, sweaty and silent, held his sword. Menelaus whispered to himself, maybe going over how he'd react if he actually saw Helen again. The silence was suffocating. At midnight, the signal flared. From a hill far beyond the city, a torch lit the sky. One quick flash and gone. The Greek fleet, hidden behind a nearby island, returned silently under moonlight. Rowers strained without splash. Sails stayed furled. Like shadows on water, the ships crept toward the shore. Back inside the city, a trapdoor on the horse creaked open. One by one, the warriors dropped down, landing softly in the square. Odysseus led them through the darkened streets like a ghost. From a nightmare, they reached the gates, killed the sleepy guards, and threw open the massive doors. Then came the roar. The Greek army surged into Troy like a flood. What followed was chaos. The Trojans woke to flames, screams, and the clash of swords in the night. Entire households fought in their nightclothes. Palaces burned, temples crumbled. The dream of victory shattered before the sun could rise. King Priam, ancient and heartbroken, died beside an altar. Neoptolemus killed him with the cold precision of a boy raised on vengeance. And if you're wondering whether the gods intervened, well, no, they watched, as they always did, curious and detached. Menelaus stormed the palace in search of Helen. He found her calm, regal, and somehow untouched by the chaos. And here's where the records get fuzzy. Some say he raised his sword, ready to strike her down. Others say she simply dropped her cloak and reminded him of why he'd crossed the sea in the first place. Either way, Helen lived. Menelaus took her back, and the two of them would later have a marriage as healthy and warm as any forged in war and betrayal. Meanwhile, Odysseus ransacked the temples for treasure and relics. He found Cassandra, still screaming prophecies, and dragged her back toward the ships as a prize. Because apparently, even being right doesn't protect you from irony. And here's your odd detail of the night. One source claims that while the Greeks were burning Troy, a drunk Trojan baker tried to smother a soldier with a sack of flour. It didn't work, but the soldier reportedly sneezed himself into a corner and missed the rest of the battle. So technically, the baker survived. By morning, Troy was ashes. Its towers crumbled, its streets ran with smoke, and the wooden horse stood eerily untouched, watching over the ruin like a smug souvenir. The Greeks, victorious but battered, began the long process of dividing the spoils. Some took gold, some took slaves, some took trinkets, many took curses, because nothing taken from a burning city comes without consequence. Even the gods seemed quiet that morning. As the fleet prepared to sail, the sea looked glassy and calm, but the Greeks knew deep down that no victory comes free. The war was over, but the stories were just beginning. Each hero would now face their own odyssey, their own unraveling. And Troy, well, Troy would become a legend, its stones scattered, its songs passed down through poets, and its horse remembered by everyone who ever heard the phrase, "Don't trust it. It's probably full of soldiers." The ships creaked as the Greeks set sail from the smoldering ruins of Troy. Their sails caught the morning breeze, and for a few precious hours, the warriors who survived 10 years of siege believed that peace lay just beyond the horizon. But the gods were not done. They rarely are when pride is involved. Agamemnon, king of kings, led the fleet home. His ships, heavy with loot and prisoners, moved in proud formation. Among his prizes, the Trojan princess Cassandra, still cursed with foresight, no one believed. She sat silently at the prow, eyes fixed on the sea, muttering of doom to come. Her warnings still ignored. Odysseus took a different route home, and if you know your myths, you know that man couldn't take a shortcut if his life depended on it. As for Menelaus and Helen, well, awkward doesn't begin to describe the vibes on their ship. She stood at the stern, her golden hair catching the wind, looking every bit the goddess she was once mistaken for. Menelaus stood beside her, not quite sure whether he was victorious or utterly defeated. Their first dinner together after 10 years. Silence and boiled fish. And now, dear listener, let's check in on Ajax the Lesser because his story gets weird. Ajax dragged the Trojan priestess Cassandra from the temple of Athena during the sack of Troy, and let's just say, the goddess was not amused. You don't disrespect a sacred altar and expect smooth sailing. So, when a sudden storm shattered his ship and cast him onto jagged rocks, few were surprised, and when he shouted at the gods, claiming no one, not even Poseidon, could drown him, Poseidon personally ensured that, in fact, he could. Ajax drowned. The sea spit him out like a bad oyster, and that's one less hero on the homeward board. Meanwhile, the homecomings were complicated. Agamemnon, for instance, had a wife waiting. Her name was Clytemnestra, and she had not been spending the past 10 years knitting sweaters and missing him. No, she had taken a lover Aegisthus and nursed a furious hatred. Why? Because Agamemnon sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia at the beginning of the war to appease the gods for wind. Yep, for wind. So when Agamemnon strutted back into Mycenae with Cassandra in tow, thinking he'd receive a hero's welcome, well, they threw him a bath instead. A bath and a murder. Clytemnestra and her lover killed him in cold water. Cassandra, true to her curse, saw it coming and walked into death, knowing she could change nothing. A tragic queen to the very end, and that's your strange but true detail. One source claims Agamemnon was murdered while getting a foot massage. Talk about dying with your boots off, but not all the homecomings were deadly. Nestor, the wise old king, actually made it back peacefully. He reunited with his family, ruled wisely, and even offered therapy sessions. Okay, not really, but the guy was practically the ancient world's life coach. Menelaus and Helen had a frostier landing. In Sparta, people looked at Helen like she was both a celebrity and a walking national disaster. Over time, though, Helen's charm reasserted itself. Poems were written, portraits painted, and the public slowly decided to blame Paris instead. Typical. Now Odysseus, he didn't get home. Not yet. In fact, his journey would take 10 more years and include a cyclops, a witch, a six-headed sea monster, and some very bad decision-making. But that's another story. As for the city of Troy, it burned for days, survivors scattered. Some say a man named Aeneas escaped with his father and son, guided by the gods, and wandered westward. Eventually, according to Roman legend, his descendants would found Rome. Whether that's true or just national propaganda, historians still debate it. And the wooden horse, abandoned. Left to rot near the ruins. No one thought to preserve it. No thank you plaque, no museum, just a relic of a trick that toppled a kingdom. That's the thing. About legends, they don't always get a neat ending. But the war was over, or so they said, because back in Greece, the seeds of new conflicts had been planted. Vengeance breeds vengeance. Families torn apart by war tend to sow the wind, and somewhere far off, the gods smiled faintly, knowing the wheel would turn again. The flames of Troy may have died out, but the embers of its war drifted far across the ancient world. In the aftermath, Greece was a patchwork of returning kings, ruined cities, and family feuds. A few victors made it home safely. For instance, returned to Pylos and spent his remaining days dishing out advice, like the elderly oracle he'd always been. But most weren't so lucky. Let's revisit Agamemnon's family tree, shall we? Because it's less a tree and more a gnarled bramble of murder and revenge. Agamemnon was murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover, But don't worry, his son Orestes would grow up, come home, and repay the favor by killing them both. You know, standard bedtime story material. And here comes one of those historians still argue moments. Some say Orestes went mad from guilt. Others say the Furies literally chased him across the land, whispering vengeance in his ears until his trial in Athens. Either way, his was a long journey through grief, justice, and personal breakdowns. Moral of the story: never name your kid something that sounds like arrested. Meanwhile, Menelaus and Helen tried to rule Sparta like the war hadn't happened. Some poets paint a picture of romantic reconciliation, others, not so much. One version even suggests Helen never went to Troy at all, that a phantom. Helen was sent there while the real one chilled out in Egypt. Honestly, if I were her, I'd have taken the Egypt vacation. Now, let's travel north to Thessaly, where Achilles' son, Neoptolemus. That son name had returned after being one of the key figures in the sack of Troy. He brought with him a Trojan princess as his wife/war prize and tried to carve out a legacy of his own. Spoiler alert, didn't end well. Depending on which version you prefer, Neoptolemus was either assassinated at Delphi or killed over a family feud. Either way, the guy had a sword and no survival instincts. But the weirdest post-war story might be that of Philoctetes. Remember him? Snake-bitten guy, marooned on an island, owned Hercules' bow. Well, after helping win the war, he tried to return to his homeland, but apparently he was no longer welcome. So he roamed like a tragic hobo hero with divine weaponry, occasionally popping up in stories like a sad, smelly side character. One strange account even claims he settled in southern Italy, founded a town, and was worshipped as a god. Whether this was fact or an ancient PR stunt is, yep, you guessed it, still debated. Meanwhile, the memory of Troy's fall began to change. Songs were sung, dramas were written, and slowly, the gritty truth of blood and fire was replaced by tales of romance and heroism. Bards preferred a poetic Achilles to a wrathful one, a noble Hector to a doomed warrior crushed by fate. It's like Instagram filters, but for mythology. And speaking of filtered legends, let's talk about Aeneas, the surviving Trojan prince in Homer's epic as a side character, would go on to star in his own saga, courtesy of the Romans. According to them, Aeneas wandered for years, landed in Italy, fought a war, and laid the spiritual groundwork for the Roman Empire. Convenient, right? The Romans basically said, sure, we sacked Troy, but we're actually descended from it, so it's fine. Kind of like crashing someone's house party and then claiming you were part of the family all along. But whether you follow Homer's version or Virgil's remix, the point stands. The war didn't really end, just spread. The ghost of Troy haunted Greece and echoed through Rome. Its fallen towers became metaphors for hubris. Its heroes became archetypes, and all because of one wooden horse and one very beautiful woman. One fun fact of the night: one ancient historian argued that Helen was never especially beautiful, just very persuasive. His reasoning: everyone who met her did something stupid. Hard to argue with that. And while we're here, remember that whole bit about gods meddling in human affairs? Well, they didn't stop. The gods had favorites, grudges, and gossip networks. Some even say the war at Troy was just their way of keeping things interesting. After all, what's immortality without a little chaos? Zeus went back to being Zeus, meaning more bad decisions with worse consequences. Athena sulked over the sack of her temple. Poseidon, still salty about losing the Trojan walls he helped build, took his anger out on Odysseus's ship like it owed him money. And Aphrodite, well, she continued to inspire love, war, and disastrous Tinder dates across the Mediterranean. So what did we learn? War ends, but drama is eternal. Especially when gods are involved, and maybe, just maybe, the true legacy of Troy isn't found in burnt stones or lost scrolls. It's in the stories passed down, in the songs, the plays, the bedtime tales that linger long after the heroes have vanished, and perhaps in the simple reminder: don't kidnap someone else's wife. So, we've burned the city, cursed the survivors, and watched the Greek heroes fumble through their happily ever afters. But if you think the drama ends there, oh, no, dear listener, only gets better. Tonight, we follow one particularly unlucky soul, Odysseus. Now, if this were a fair tale, he'd be sailing home to Ithaca, greeted by his faithful wife Penelope and loyal dog Argos, with a hearty feast waiting. But this is ancient Greece, where gods hold grudges and logic takes naps. Odysseus' journey, as Homer immortalized in the Odyssey, should have taken weeks. It took 10 years. That's longer than the actual Trojan War. But let's start simple. He sets sail with a handful of ships and a hopeful crew. Spirits are high, morale is strong, the sea is calm. First stop, the land of the Lotus Eaters. Sounds peaceful, right? Except the locals offer his men flowers that erase all memory. Suddenly, his crew's acting like they've discovered ancient weed gummies, lounging around like vacationers with no plans. So Odysseus does what any responsible leader would do. He drags his men back to the ships like a parent at Disneyland, saying, "We're leaving now." Next up, Cyclops. Yes, the big one-eyed guy with a fondness for raw sailor meat. Polyphemus is not exactly a gracious host. He traps them in a cave and starts eating the guests. So, Odysseus, being clever and perhaps overly dramatic, tells the Cyclops his name is nobody. When they blind him with a wooden stake, because nothing screams hospitality like violence Polyphemus screams, "Nobody is hurting me, and no one comes to help." Wordplay. 1. Cyclops. 0. But here's where our boy Odysseus messes up. As they're sailing away, he yells out his real name like a kid signing his graffiti. "It was me, Odysseus of Ithaca." Cue Poseidon's rage. Because Polyphemus was Poseidon's son. And nothing gets under a sea god's scales like someone poking out his kid's only eye. From this point on, Poseidon's on a personal mission to make Odysseus' life miserable. Think divine TSA harassment. But so the voyage turns into a highlight reel of disasters. The island of Elus, keeper of the winds, gives Odysseus a bag of air to speed his journey. But his crew, assuming it's treasure, opens at mid-sea. Storms erupt. Progress, reset, Lastrygonians, giant cannibals who destroy nearly every ship, from fleet commander to dinghy captain in one meal. Circe, the enchantress, turns his crew into pigs. Actual pigs. Odysseus, with help from Hermes, resists her spell, spends a year on her island, and somehow doesn't turn into bacon. It's complicated. Quick reminder, we're still only halfway. At one point, he even visits the underworld for advice. Imagine that. "Hi, I'm lost. Could you ask the dead for directions?" Down there, he chats with fallen warriors, including Achilles, who admits he'd rather be a nobody farmer alive than a famous corpse. Ouch. Back on Earth, more hazards await. The sirens, whose voices lure sailors to their doom. Odysseus ties himself to the mast so he can listen without jumping overboard. What can we say? The man has issues. Scylla and Charybdisa, sea monster and a whirlpool. He steers too close to Scylla and loses 6 men, a grim reminder. Sometimes the only choice is which disaster you prefer. The cattle of Helios, which Odysseus warns his crew not to touch. Naturally, they eat them. The sun god throws a celestial tantrum. Zeus strikes their ship. Everyone dies except Odysseus. Eventually, after floating on driftwood for days, Odysseus washes ashore on the island of Calypso, a goddess who promptly keeps him for 7 years. Yes, you heard right. 7 years. She offers him immortality, eternal youth, and a really nice cave. He says no, because he wants to go home. Either he truly loved Penelope, or he really hated cave decor. Eventually, the gods step in finally, and force Calypso to let him go. He builds a raft, sails off only to be wrecked again by Poseidon, who is still mad. This is now personal. Somehow, by sheer luck and the help of another princess, because ancient heroes never go more than 2 chapters without a helpful princess, he lands in Phaeacia. The locals are shocked by his story, throw him a feast, and finally send him home. And what does he find in Ithaca after 20 years? A house full of suitors trying to marry his wife and steal his kingdom. Penelope, queen of loyalty and passive resistance, has kept them at bay with a legendary excuse. "I'll choose a husband once I finish this tapestry." She weaves by day, unweaves by night. Genius. Odysseus, in disguise, returns as a beggar, surveys the chaos, then strings his bow and surprise. Wins an archery contest only he could win. Let's just say the suitors do not live happily ever after. Now, before we wrap up this whirlwind tale of misfortune and monsters, here's your weird fact of the night. In some lesser-known versions of the story, Odysseus is eventually exiled, again killed by his own son with Circe. Yup, after everything, a family misunderstanding takes him out. So what do we take from this? First, maybe don't blind sea monsters. Second, sometimes the long way home is the only way. And third, if a goddess offers you immortality in a beachfront cave, consider it. We've sailed through a decade-long war, survived a cursed return journey, and now it's time to tackle something really confusing: myth, memory, and marketing. Tonight, we ask the question, did the Trojan War actually happen, or was it just an ancient PR campaign gone rogue? Let's start with the basics. For centuries, people thought the whole story Prince Helen, the wooden horse, was pure legend, a myth, a bedtime tale for Greek kids to scare them off, eloping with foreign princesses. But then along came a man, named Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century, a self-taught archaeologist with a flair for drama and, let's be honest, questionable methods. Schliemann was convinced the city of Troy was real and he was going to find it. and somehow, he did. In modern-day Turkey, he uncovered the ruins of a city at a site now called historic, layer upon layer of ancient cities built on top of one another. One layer, in particular, dated to around 1200 BCE, burned, destroyed. Bingo. Was it the Troy? That's still debated, of course, because historians, as we now know, never agree on anything except how much they disagree. But Schliemann was so excited, he called one of the golden hoards he found Priam's treasure, as in King Priam, father of Hector, except it was likely from a different era entirely. Details right. He even gave some of the treasure to his wife to wear in a photoshoot because nothing says responsible archaeology like playing dress-up with priceless artifacts. So was there a war? Here's the weird part. Probably, yes. Around 1200 BC, civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Mycenaean palaces in Greece were abandoned. The Hittite Empire disappeared. Egypt barely survived attacks by mysterious sea peoples. It was chaos. So, maybe, just maybe, there was a conflict over Troy, just not exactly as the poets sang it. There's evidence of trade between Troy and Greece, and there are Hittite tablets that mention a place called Wilusa, which sounds suspiciously like Ilias, another name for Troy, and a king named Alexandru, maybe Alexander, aka Paris. It's like trying to reconstruct an action movie from newspaper clippings. What we know is this: there was a city, it was wealthy, strategically located on trade routes, and it burned violently. But where the Hellen's face launched 1,000 ships or just one disgruntled merchant navy, that's where the myths take over. Now, here's your odd fact for the night. Some ancient sources suggest the Greeks didn't build a horse at Albert used an earthquake. The horse was a symbol of Poseidon, god of earthquakes, so perhaps the wooden horse was poetic shorthand for we snuck in after the walls collapsed. Honestly, I prefer the horse. It's more theatrical. Another theory: the horse was actually a siege engine, a kind of battering ram or mobile tower that Greeks used to breach the city. Or maybe it was just a bribe, some gift offered to the Trojans in exchange for access, because sometimes the oldest trick in the book is just a trick. And let's talk about the timing. Homer's Iliad was written centuries after the war supposedly happened. That's like writing an epic poem about Napoleon based on local gossip, family rumors, and the occasional dream. Yet despite that, the Greeks treated it as history. In fact, Alexander the Great carried a copy of the Iliad into battle by his tutor, Aristotle, no less. Imagine having homework that follows you into war. So what does all this tell us? Maybe that the Trojan War was a blend, part fact, part fiction, a real event, inflated and dramatized until it became the ultimate tale of love, betrayal, and heroism. And like all great stories, the truth doesn't get in the way of a good ending. Also, let's not forget the Etruscans and Romans, who believed their ancestors were Trojans who fled after the war. Aeneas, a Trojan prince, was said to have journeyed west and founded the roots of Rome. So if you're keeping score, the Trojan War isn't just a Greek myth. It's also an Italian origin story, and probably an early version of European real estate marketing. Our city was founded by heroes fleeing a war. Join now. And now, since we're here in the haze between memory and myth, let's imagine what Troy might have looked like. Golden sunlight on white limestone walls, banners fluttering, markets bustling with spices and copper, bronze helmeted guards at the gates, and, maybe, somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of wooden wheels rolling toward destiny. Because whether it was real, remembered, or rewritten, Troy still burns in our imagination. So, the war ends, Troy falls, everyone is either dead, missing, or writing poetry about it. And what happens next? Well, here's a fun fact. In ancient epics, the real mess starts after the credits roll. Tonight, we follow the poor souls who survived the Trojan War and learn that coming home is sometimes harder than winning. Let's begin with Odysseus, because of course we will. You remember him, the crafty guy who built the horse? Well, apparently the gods didn't like how smug he was afterward, because they turned his quick return home into a 10-year detour full of monsters, storms, witches, and very bad map reading. Seriously, this man got lost for a decade. At that point, even the GPS would give up and say, good luck. His adventures were later compiled in Homer's Odyssey, the world's earliest excuse for being late. Sorry dear, I ran into a cyclops. While Odysseus was dodging temptation and cyclones, things weren't much better for the other Greeks. Take Agamemnon, the high king who started the war. He made it home to Mycenae, walked straight into a soap opera. His wife, Clytemnestra, wasn't exactly thrilled with him, especially since he sacrificed their daughter before leaving for war. Oops. So, when he stepped through the door, she and her new lover promptly murdered him in the bathtub. Moral of the story: maybe text your wife before coming home after 10 years. Then there was Menelaus, the husband of Helen. Despite the chaos, he and Helen made it back to Sparta eventually. Depending on the version you believe, they either lived happily ever after, or she left again and started a perfume line in Egypt. Yes, Egypt. We'll get there. Other warriors didn't even make it past the shoreline. Some Greek ships were wrecked by storms. Others were cursed by angry gods. It's almost like invading a city under divine protection wasn't the smartest idea, but the most interesting story. That's Aeneas, a Trojan prince who didn't die in the siege. Instead, he gathered survivors and escaped. That's right, while the Greeks were looting, Aeneas slipped away with his dad on his back and his son in tow, leading a group of ragtag refugees. Think Moses meets the Fast and the Furious. His journey, told in Virgil's Aeneid, takes him across the Mediterranean, through burning cities, stormy seas, and awkward divine matchmaking. Eventually, he landed in Italy, and his descendants, according to Roman legend, they became the founders of Rome. Because what better way to build an empire than by claiming our ancestors survived the most famous war in history and then started this pizza party? Now, here's your weird detail of the night. In some versions, Helen never went to Troy at all. Yep, according to the playwright Euripides, the real Helen was whisked away to Egypt by Hermes, and the one Paris took to Troy was just a cloud copy, like a divine hologram. So the Greeks fought a 10-year war over a mistake in the shipping label. Imagine explaining that to your army. We've destroyed an entire civilization over a cloud. And then we have Cassandra the prophetess who foresaw everything but was cursed so no one would believe her. Taken as a war prize by Agamemnon, she too was murdered upon arrival in Mycenae. Truly, Greek epics do not believe in happy endings for women who were right all along. But one thing unites these tales: homecoming was never easy. The Greeks called it nostos, the return home. And in nearly every version, that return is full of suffering, loss, and regret. Some warriors found their lands taken, others found their families gone. Many returned not to applause, but to silence and an eerie sense that the world had moved on without them, kind of like coming back from vacation to find your plants dead, your cat indifferent, and your neighbors living in your house, and the gods, they barely lifted a finger. It's as if they got bored once the war ended. Or perhaps they were too busy with their own melodramas to care about mortal heartbreak. Still, the stories lived on. Greek poets and playwrights turned these tragic homecomings into tales of revenge, madness, and sometimes redemption. They asked, what happens when the hero has no war left to fight? A question that still haunts soldiers today. And here's your history one-side moment. Some scholars believe the whole Nostos tradition reflects a real cultural trauma. Generation of warriors who went off to fight a vague, long war and came back to a collapsed world. Because when you line up the dates, the fall of Troy coincides with the late Bronze Age collapse, a period of massive upheaval, population movement, and societal decline. It's like the ancient version of a global recession meets climate disaster meets war fatigue. So perhaps the stories of cursed homecomings weren't just myths, but coded memories of a civilization unraveling. And while we may not know exactly who built the horse, who burned the city, or which goddess really started it all, we know this much: after Troy, the world was never quite the same. Let's take a deep breath. Friends, Troy has fallen. The heroes have limped home, more not. So now what? Tonight, we drift past the wreckage of one war and into the myths that followed, the scattered echoes of Troy across the ancient world. You see, stories never really die. They migrate, and nowhere did they migrate more majestically than to Rome, the rising star of the Mediterranean. Because while the Greeks were writing tragedies about their heroes not coping very well with peace, the Romans were claiming to be the descendants of Trojan refugees. Remember Aeneas from last time? The guy who fled the burning city with his dad and his destiny. Yeah, according to Roman legend, he didn't just settle in Italy. His descendants eventually gave birth to Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, who were, according to lore, raised by a wolf. because apparently being a refugee with divine ancestry just wasn't dramatic enough. In this version of the story, Troy doesn't fall and vanish, it transforms. It becomes the seed of a new empire. The pain becomes power. The ashes become glory. It's like history's way of saying, when life gives you war trauma, build a republic. Now, before you roll your eyes at how convenient that sounds, it's worth noting, the Romans took this claim very seriously. So seriously that Julius Caesar, centuries later, insisted that he was a direct descendant of Aeneas and the goddess Venus. That's right. Caesar's family tree included a Trojan prince and a love goddess. Meanwhile, my family tree includes one guy who was banned from the village for stealing goats. And now, for tonight's off-topic gem, the Romans also believed that the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena, had been smuggled out of Troy by Aeneas, secretly preserved in Rome. Yes, a divine statue, stolen from a ruined city, kept safe through storms and centuries. Kind of like the ancient version of a USB drive with all your civilization's passwords on it. Roman temples supposedly built entire vaults to house the thing. No one could agree on where it was, or if it existed. But still they swore it was there, somewhere, watching over the empire. Meanwhile, Greek cities, especially Sparta and Athens, also tried to claim links to the Trojan saga. Everyone wanted a piece of the myth. Because here's the strange truth. While Troy was a disaster for the people who lived through it, it was gold for the people who came after. Poets, kings, generals, they all rewrote the war to serve their needs. If you needed a justification for conquest, say you're avenging Troy. If you needed divine favor, claim descent from Hector. If your empire needed a cool origin story, boom, we were Trojans. It's the ancient version of that one friend who claims they're 1/16th Viking. Whenever you bring up ancestry, even beyond Greece and Rome, echoes of Troy can be found in Celtic legends, Persian tales, even Norse sagas. Like an ancient song, the war's rhythm carried on, changing notes, changing lyrics, but never vanishing. Now, back to the ruins themselves. For centuries, Troy was considered a mythical city, like Atlantis or El Dorado. No one could find it. Scholars debated if it ever existed. Some said Homer made it up entirely, just a bedtime story gone rogue. But then came the 19th century and a man named Heinrich Schliemann. He was part archaeologist, part treasure hunter, part wildly overconfident enthusiast. He believed Troy was real, and not only that, but he thought he could find it. Spoiler, he did. Kind of. In the ruins of Hisarlik, in modern-day Turkey, Schliemann unearthed ancient walls, gates, pottery, evidence of a city that had burned multiple times, rebuilt, and then burned again. It wasn't just a city, it was layers of cities, stacked like an onion of tragedies. He even claimed to have found Priam's treasure, a cache of golden jewelry and weapons, and in a truly historical facepalm moment, he had his wife pose for a photo wearing them despite them being thousands of years too old for the Trojan War. Oops. Modern archaeologists have since refined his findings. We now believe that Troy Vi, or Troy Vir1 of the layers matches the likely timeline of the war described by Homer. In other words, there was a great city, it was destroyed in battle, and it was located right where the myth said. But whether it fell to a wooden horse or just a really aggressive siege, historians still argue. Some believe the war wasn't about a woman, but trade routes. Troy sat on a prime spot linking the Aegean and Black Seas. Others think the war was actually a series of conflicts, slowly retold into one poetic firestorm. Some suggest there was no war at all, just a legendary metaphor for the collapse of the Bronze Age world. Because, as we've learned, myth and memory are very cozy roommates, and Troy sits at the crossroads of both. So tonight, we leave the battlefield behind and walk through the dusty halls of memory, where every cracked wall and faded statue tells a story of love that sparked wars, of heroes that didn't come home, of cities that rose from the ashes of others, of lies that became legends, and of poets, like Homer and Virgil, who gave shape to the chaos. Because sometimes the truth isn't found in weapons or timelines, but in the stories people choose to carry forward. And Troy, that story never really ended. So, we've walked the ruins, we've listened to the echoes of spears clashing, hearts breaking, and poets scheming. But tonight, let's do something bolder. Let's zoom out, because while Troy burned in its corner of the Aegean, the rest of the Bronze Age world was not having a great time either. Welcome to the Late Bronze Age Collapse, or as I like to call it, the ancient world's worst group project. Around the 12th century BC, roughly when the Trojan War was said to happen, entire civilizations began to fall apart like an overcooked cake. The Mycenaean Greeks, gone. The Hittite Empire, vanished. Ugarit, the sparkling port city on the Syrian coast, smoked. Even Egypt, the mighty new kingdom under Ramesses III, barely limped through, surviving but bruised. So what happened? Did everyone just decide to take a long vacation? Unfortunately, no. Scholars blame a perfect storm. Invasions, drought, famine, earthquakes, internal revolts, and the infamous Sea Peoples. Who were the Sea Peoples? Great question. Nobody really knows. That's right, a whole alliance of mysterious invaders with no clear origin, who swept through the eastern Mediterranean like a swarm of very grumpy pirates. Some say they were displaced tribes from Europe. Others think they were a loose confederation of raiders and refugees. Others shrugged. Even Egyptian records described them as coming from the sea, which is like writing attacked by vague wet guys. And just like that, cities that had stood for centuries collapsed. Trade networks unraveled. Writing systems disappeared. The world shrank into darkness and silence, and yet Troy's story survived. Now, I promised you an odd detail. And here it is. One of the earliest documented strikes in history happened around this time in Egypt by tomb builders. Yes, even as the world was crumbling, a group of workers laid down their tools and said, "We are not getting paid enough for this apocalypse." Honestly, respect. So how does this collapse connect to Troy? Well, many believe that the war Homer wrote about was just one star in a galaxy of chaos, that the fall of Troy wasn't unique, but part of a sweeping unraveling of the old world, and this adds a new layer to the tale. Maybe it wasn't just about Helen, maybe it wasn't just about Paris, maybe it was a civilization holding on to its final stories before the lights went out. In fact, some archaeologists now use Troy as a kind of case study for the whole collapse, a microcosm, a glimpse into a larger tragedy. And yet, despite the darkness that followed, something incredible happened. New cultures emerged from the rubble. The Greeks reinvented themselves. The Phoenicians built ships and alphabets. Small villages began laying the foundation for what would one day become Athens, Rome, and Carthage. It's like watching the ashes of a campfire glow back to life. A new world was coming, but not before. A very long nap, historically speaking. And in this quiet aftermath, people remembered Troy. Even without cities or empires, they told the story. Around fires, in temples, on cracked pieces of pottery, they remembered a city by the sea, a woman too beautiful to exist, a war too long to justify, a horse too clever to trust. Which brings us to one last twist. The horse. Ah, yes, the wooden celebrity itself. We all know the version from Virgil's Aeneid. Greeks build a big horse, pretend it's a gift. Trojans bring it in. Surprise, disaster. But here's the kicker. Homer never mentions the horse in detail. In the Iliad, the war ends before the horse enters stage left, which makes us wonder, was the horse even real? Some theories suggest it was a metaphor, a siege engine, like a battering ram or tower. Others think it could have been a coded reference to an earthquake, since horses were sacred to Poseidon, god of quakes. Or maybe it was just a brilliant story someone made up over drinks. And then it stuck. Because sometimes the best lies survive the longest. So here we are. The ancient world crumbled, empires fell, myths were born, and yet, through it all Troy endured, not in bricks or stones, but in memory. And now so have you. You made it through the late Bronze Age collapse. You survived sea peoples, wooden horses, and divine drama. You deserve a blanket and some cookies. The fire is out, the warriors are gone. But the story of Troy doesn't end just because the city fell. No, tonight we follow the aftershocks, because after the war came the wandering. Let's start with the Greeks. Once the dust settled and the flames died down, the surviving warriors began their long journeys home. And let's just say it did not go smoothly. Odysseus, he took 10 years to get back to Ithaca, blown off course to Egypt. Agamemnon, murdered in the bathtub by his wife. Honestly, not a great Yelp review for post-war returns. But tonight, we turn our gaze to someone else. Aeneas. You might remember him, the Trojan prince who, according to later Roman legend, escaped the burning city with his father Anchises and young son Ascanius. Now, Homer barely mentions him, but the Romans, they made him a superstar. Why? Because Aeneas, they claimed, was the founder of Rome. That's right. Virgil's Aeneid picks up where the Iliad ends. It tells the tale of Aeneas wandering the Mediterranean, facing storms, monsters, and a heartbreakingly doomed romance with Queen Dido of Carthage, all while searching for a new home. Spoiler, he finds Italy, and his descendants, centuries later, would supposedly build the Roman Empire. See how neatly that works. Rome, the eternal city, doesn't just appear. It's tied to the ruins of Troy. One city falls, another rises. It's a historical relay race, complete with drama, destiny, and divine meddling. Now, is any of this true? Well, historians still debate whether Aeneas ever existed, or whether he was just Rome's PR stunt, a mythical ancestor designed to give their empire a touch of tragic grandeur. But here's where things get spooky. Archaeological digs in central Italy have found evidence of Eastern Mediterranean pottery, the kind you'd associate with Anatolia or the Aegean, dating to just after Troy's fall. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. Now, for your strange detail of the night, in Roman times, there was a cult that worshipped Aeneas as a god of piety. They offered sacrifices to his spirit and carved his image on statues. Imagine being so good at running from a burning city that people pray to you for 800 years. Honestly, impressive. But the idea of Troy birthing Rome isn't just mythologically, speaks to a deeper truth, that the fall of one world often becomes the foundation of another. Civilizations recycle, legends pass hands, stories get new coats of paint. And Troy, it became everyone's origin story. The Greeks claimed it to explain their heroes. The Romans claimed it to justify their empire. Even medieval Europeans said their ancestors came from Troy. The British once believed they descended from a Trojan named Brutus, not the ET-21, a different Brutus. Apparently, if your lineage didn't go through Troy, you weren't trying hard enough. Troy became a universal myth, a shared memory stitched into cultures that had never even seen the Aegean. And what about the real Trojans? Well, they disappeared from history, but maybe they live on in all these tales. And maybe, just maybe, they live on in you listening to this bedtime story. Halfway across the world, wondering how much of it is real. One last joke before you drift off. If you ever want to start a new civilization, remember step 1 is lose a war in spectacular fashion. Step 2, wait 700 years. Step 3, get written into a national epic. Easy, right? Now that Troy has fallen, the heroes have wandered, and legends have scattered to the wind, you might think the story is over. But no, tonight, we explore how Troy refused to stay buried, because while the city burned in myth, it slept in soil for over 2,000 years, forgotten, doubted, even laughed at, for centuries. Most scholars believed that Troy was a fiction, a poetic stage set for Homer's imagination. A great story, sure, but like Atlantis entirely made up. Until a man with a mustache and a lot of dynamite came along. Enter Heinrich Schliemann. In the 1870s, this German businessman turned amateur archaeologist decided he was going to find Troy using nothing but Homer, hope, and questionable excavation methods. Now, Schliemann wasn't exactly a trained archaeologist. He dug like a kid in a sandbox, fast, reckless, and way too excited. But against all odds, he found something. He dug into a hill in northwestern Turkey, known as his Salik, and uncovered layers upon layers of ancient cities stacked on top of each other, like a historical lasagna. Among the ruins, he discovered burnt walls, fallen towers, and what he believed was Priam's treasure, a glittering hoard of gold, jewelry, and weapons. He even had his wife pose in the jewelry and called her Helen of Troy. Bold move, honestly. But here's the twist. Schliemann may have dug too deep. Historians now think the level he identified as Homer's. Troy was from a much earlier period, possibly 1,000 years too old. Oops. Later, excavations revealed a more likely candidate, Troy 7, a city with thick walls, signs of fire, and evidence of sudden collapse, around 1200 BCE. Now that sounds suspiciously like a city caught in a war. So did Schliemann find Troy? Well, sort of. He definitely found a Troy, maybe even the Troy. But the answer still isn't crystal clear. Historians still debate whether Troy VII was destroyed by Greeks, by an earthquake, or maybe by an internal uprising. It's one of those maddening, we're close, but not quite mysteries. But what's certain is that Troy was real. It wasn't just a metaphor or a literary backdrop. It was a place people lived, fought, and died in. A city that rose and fell over centuries, each version building on the bones of the last dot, and for a story long thought to be fantasy. That's a remarkable second act. Here's your strange tidbit. For the night, when Schliemann smuggled the treasure out of Turkey, he hid it in barrels of sardines. You can't make this up. The treasure eventually ended up in Berlin, then vanished during World War II, and was finally revealed decades later to be held in Russia, quietly displayed in a museum under tight security. So, technically, parts of Troy are now exiled in a fish-smuggling subplot. As for the site of Troy itself, you can visit it today. It's not a towering city with marble gates. It's a series of low walls, worn by time, surrounded by dry grass and quiet hills. But if you close your eyes and listen to the wind, you might hear whispers of bronze armor, clashing, horses neighing, and someone yelling, "Do not bring that wooden thing inside the gates." One last joke for the road. Schliemann thought Homer's Iliad was a map. Most people think IKEA instructions are harder to follow. He might have been right. Troy was real. Homer was. Maybe Hatrat and bedtime stories. They're how we keep ruins alive. Troy may have burned, but its echoes carried far across seas, through ages, into myths, and even into bedtime stories like this one. In our final chapter tonight, we follow what happened after the war ended, not to the city, but to its survivors, its destroyers, and the tales they carried home. Because, if there's one thing ancient wars never give you, it's a clean ending. Let's start with the Greeks, the so-called victors. Their victory, it turns out, was the beginning of a long string of misfortunes. Odysseus took 10 years to get home, ran into cyclopes, witches, sirens, and almost got eaten several times. Standard post-war commute. Agamemnon walked into his palace and got murdered in the bathtub by his wife. Let's just say family reunions in Mycenae were a little tense. Menelaus eventually found Helen and forgave her. Or, so they say. Honestly, historians still debate whether Helen ever went to Troy at all. Some sources say she was in Egypt the whole time, sipping date wine and dodging drama. Even Achilles' son Neoptolemus, who supposedly carried on the family name, died in some versions after getting into a dispute over a woman. Clearly, the apple didn't fall far from the angry, spear-hurling tree. As for the Trojans, some tales say a small band survived, escaping into exile, led by a prince named Aeneas, who supposedly carried his father on his back, his son in his arms, and the future of Rome in his blood. Aeneas' legend would later become the foundation of Virgil's Aeneid, which claimed the Trojans didn't vanish. They just relocated to Italy and founded the Roman people. Yet the Romans believed they were descendants of Troy. It's like saying, we didn't lose, we just started a new civilization. And you know what? That's kind of brilliant. But even centuries later, the war's aftermath wouldn't leave literature alone. Medieval writers told of knights who claimed Trojan ancestry. Renaissance painters reimagined the fall of Troy with capes, castles, and the occasional weirdly accurate cat and the wooden horse. It became a metaphor for betrayal, strategy, and most recently computer viruses. So yes, the Trojans technically also invaded your laptop. Here's an odd little fact. In some medieval versions of the story, the horse wasn't even a horse, was a giant wooden statue of Minerva, or sometimes a ship. Medieval storytelling was flexible, but what remains constant through all versions in ancient medieval, modernized the feeling that Troy wasn't just a city, it was a mirror, a place where ambition, love, power, betrayal, and tragedy all collided. Reminder that even the strongest walls can fall, that victory comes with consequences, and that stories, once told, can shape the future. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real reason Troy never died. It wasn't the flames or the sword that gave it immortality. It was the memory, the people who told it, whispered it, passed it along, from bard to poet, from scribe to screenwriter, from us to you. So now, dear listener, as the last embers of Troy fade and the dust of battle settles, it's time to let the night take over. Let's slow things down for a moment. Let the wind grow still. Imagine a quiet hillside in the Aegean, where the moonlight dances on ancient stone, and wildflowers grow where kings once wept. There are no armies here, no gods, just the soft sound of the sea beyond the ruins. You lie beneath a sky that has watched over millennia, wrapped in the calm of a world long gone but never forgotten. The voices of the past are hushed. Now, the war is over. You are safe, you are home, and, in this silence, where myth and memory meet, may your dreams carry you gently, like a ship across starlit water, to the shores of rest. Good night.